Hi, I'm Nat.
I'm Erin.
And I'm Shy.
And you're listening to Metamashina, a bi-weekly podcast on genre fiction from the feminine gaze. This week, we are joined by two very special guests. We have Rachel and Kirsty, co-hosts of the Scavengers Horde podcast. Very good podcasts in the Star Wars fandom. Ladies, would you like to introduce yourselves? I guess I kind of introduced you for you, but...
Yeah, I'm Rachel, and as has been mentioned, I'm one of the co-hosts of Scavengers Horde, a Star Wars podcast.
Hi, I'm Kirsty. Thanks for having us on today.
No, thank you for having
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you for
Oh
coming.
yeah, thank you. Thanks. Sorry, I forgot my manners.
And I think it's important to note you guys had us on as guests previously and were part of our journey into podcasting, so we thank you for that as well.
Yeah, definitely. No, this is true. Like it's been great actually just getting that feedback back and forth and just seeing how you guys the podcast evolved, and it was a real big inspiration for us.
Oh, that's really nice. Thank you.
Thanks, that's sweet.
So usually we start out with a little bit of how our week is going, and I think that we can safely say that we all are having the same experience right now. I don't think we need to even do a personal thing for everybody, because I'm pretty sure that every single one of us is just on bated breath for the new Star Wars. So
Yeah, it will be really interesting actually, because when this episode airs, the movie will have come out. So we'll get to see retroactively if our expectations and our excitement matches up to what we have seen.
And
a little bit of a view into the past.
Yeah, and Rachel will be the first of us to go, right?
Yeah, I see on the 12th.
Yes. And the European premiere too, right? That's so awesome.
Yes.
So
I need my ticket to turn up. That's making me a bit anxious.
Yeah.
But yeah, it should hopefully turn up tomorrow, and as long as it does, then I'm fine. And if it doesn't, then I'm getting straight on the phone and having a panic attack and saying, "What happened to my ticket? I paid lots of money." So yeah, I'm sure it'll be fine, but it just kind of makes me preemptively nervous, and it's like, oh god, how do I look halfway presentable? Will they chuck me off the red carpet if I don't look smart enough and stuff? But I'm not gonna go in ripped jeans and trainers or something. So
no,
yeah, it's fine. Do you have trainers in America, or would you say sneakers?
We say sneakers for sure.
Or
sneakers,
shoes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Or running shoes. Yep.
We say running shoes up here.
I love trainers though.
I'm glad. I like that word too. Sorry.
No, it's okay. There's always stuff that we can cut about that, but yeah. I get periodically stuck with the giggles, so I'm really sorry. That's one of the things I have to cut out.
You say you'll cut it. You say you'll cut the stuff, but we always end up keeping us talking like fools.
Yep. Yep.
I'll have to try and keep my professional demeanor voice on.
We're not professionals. We are so far from professional. I mean, we talk about I don't know. We just talk about the most raunchy shit on here anyway. So yeah. Don't worry, we won't get too deep into the. We'll try to make sure that your reputation is not tarnished by ours.
Appreciated very much.
Oh, just to ask a quick question here. Have we actually introduced the topic yet?
No, that's what I was going to do as soon as I stopped laughing. Okay.
Okay. All right. Sorry, my bad.
So on today's episode, we will be talking about fanfiction. Fanfiction is a topic that's very much beloved to all of us. Historically, it's been considered the kind of domain of women, and especially women in fandom, because 1/3 of all content online about books is fanfiction, if you can believe it. So, Chai, did you want to go into what fanfiction is?
Sure. I'll try to keep it really brief just because there's just so much content about this. So fanfiction is basically transformative fiction written by fans that is based off of a pre-existing piece of media. It's a little bit like meta in that it can't exist without that original text, but it serves a very different function. And while fanfiction can sometimes stem from a desire to continue a story after its natural endpoint, like after the canon ends, it's usually done to add something to the narrative that was missing from the canon. And within fanfiction, there's a lot of subgenres to fanfiction. So there's like alternative universe fanfiction, there's crossover fanfiction, where you mix two different canon sources together. There's slash fanfiction, which is male-male pairing. And within each fandom's fanfiction community, so like for Star Wars, for example, or Harry Potter, there are tropes specific to that piece of media. And a really good example of a fandom trope would be the girl in Middle-earth trope from the Lord of the Rings fan fiction, where a girl from our world falls into Middle-earth to assist the canon characters in fighting Mordor.
I wouldn't fight Mordor if I was the villain.
Well, you'd
be joining it.
Okay? I stand for the Balrogs. But
I'm just waiting for my orc husband to come along.
But essentially, as Nat mentioned, fanfiction is written predominantly by women and other marginalized groups as a way for us to talk about narratives that are often overlooked or dialed back in mainstream media. And another major part that I really have to mention that is pretty central to fanfiction these days, I guess it was central back then too, but it really is now, is shipping. So shipping is the act of pairing two characters romantically together, and once they are paired, they are called a ship, and ships have portmanteau or names are combined together. So Reylo is Kylo Ren and Rey, and these ships can either be realized in the canon themselves, canon compliant, fandom based, or a crack ship, which is basically it would never happen in canon, but people just enjoy the dynamic. And then you get sub fandoms evolving around these fictional pairings, and sometimes big conflicts around these pairings.
Oh, we wouldn't know anything about that.
When it can occur between conflicts can occur when characters from one pairing is featured in another pairing, and each group of fans is hoping their favorite pairing becomes canon. So that is also a large part of fan fiction these days and fandom in general.
So in terms of the history of fan fiction, I'm just going to start off by talking a little bit about that. The way that we've considered the modern history of fan fiction nowadays is starting during the 60s and 70s with Star Trek. Basically, Star Trek fan fiction was published in zines that women shared. Yes, again, it was mostly women. It was 73% like in the 70s and 93% by the 80s of women that were writing fan fiction within the Star Trek fandom. And that led to, other franchises having kind of a similar response, whether you have Star Wars had its own kind of community of fanfic writers, to the point that Lucasfilm even issued a letter saying that they were not allowed to put porn into their fanfic because somebody had shared that with some of the actors. Yeah.
And they were just traded at like conventions and things through the 70s and 80s.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And distributed on mailing lists.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to note that during the same thing was actually happening in Japan with doujinshi. So when manga and anime were first starting to become popular, you had a lot of independent creators that were creating their own versions of that. And actually, just like fan fiction, a lot of people actually started professional careers by starting with that fan work and became recognized through it. So there's this essentially, even though it's kind of considered maybe subliterary in the sense that it's not considered, publishable by any means, because of course there's obviously the content is protected. It's definitely been a pathway for a lot of professionals into the industry itself. So you had, women that were writing Star Trek fan fiction that actually ended up writing episodes or books within the series. You have a lot of other examples over time. All right. And so I think Shai is probably the best person, or maybe Aaron as well, to explain what the period in the 2000s was like for fan fiction.
I can just start by saying I think it all started really with the launch of fanfiction.net in 1998.
So basically, after fanfiction, once the 2000s began, fanfiction began its migration off of GeoCities pages and zines and stuff into LiveJournal and fanfiction.net. And these were the really big sites for fanfiction before Archive of Our Own, Tumblr, and a couple of independent sites. And it was basically a way for fans to collect fanfiction from multiple fandoms and easily locate it in the same place. It was much more convenient than it had been before. People really liked it. This is also when I first started getting involved in fandom and fanfiction.
Same.
So it was a really interesting, in the beginning, it was a really interesting time to be through. Unfortunately, that didn't last too long because fanfiction came under attack from outside forces. In the early 2000s, same-sex relationships were not as accepted as they are now, and women were really, really badly shunned from fandoms unless they conformed to certain male-centric narratives, right? Like, I mean, we've talked before about how there's issues being a female fan in fandom now, but it used to be way worse. And there was this whole moral panic about fan fiction from these Christian right groups about the state of the internet and how you couldn't trust anyone online. It was real think of the children stuff. And they started attacking fan fiction as the new prevailing evil, just like they had done to the comic industry and radio and video games. And fan fiction sites like fanfiction.net actually were added to censorship lists that were passed out to schools and public libraries. I
remember the day that I would go to my library on during lunch, like when I was in junior high, and I would read fanfiction on fanfiction.net, and then there came a day when it was blacklisted by the school and I couldn't read it anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was they basically, I had that same experience too, where you log on to the public internet and try to read it at the library, and you're told as restricted content. It wasn't illegal, but they basically put it on the same level as porn and drugs and criminality, right? And all fan fiction was labeled like this, right? And it was really weird. Like as a young teenager, it felt really weird. It made you feel dirty because here you were enjoying this like really female-centric fan space where there was narratives that were catering to you, and then all of a sudden you are told that it's bad, right?
Yeah, I remember just having this overwhelming sense of like looking over my shoulder, wondering if the internet police were going to come along and crucify me.
And so this culminated in the first fanfiction.net purge, which was in 2002. So basically responding to pressure from conservative groups, the mods at fanfiction.net began a major removal of NC-related content from the archives. And the part of this was that the excuse was, once again, think of the children. But I mean, to even get to the adult stuff on fanfiction.net beforehand, you had to go through several control stages where you were given ample warnings going into it, right? Like I remember being told this has adult content and then clicking okay anyways, right?
Yeah.
Because you still want to go read it, right?
I was just going to say, I remember I had an email address, like a Yahoo email address that I had purposely constructed with an age over 18 because writing fan fiction, they made you verify your age through your email address sometimes even.
Yeah. Yeah, it was so there was controls there ahead of time, but the conservative groups didn't want it. A petition was started to try to reverse the ban. It ended up with over 23,000 signatures, but nothing was done. These fics were deleted. And as a result of this deletion of fanfiction, the site adultfanfiction.net was created. And I have not been on there in years. It was very, very active back in the Web 1.0 era. Right? So the aughts continued on, and then we had in 2017 we had the live journal Strikethrough and Boldthrough, and that was so once again facing pressure to clean up its act by right-wing groups. Live journal began to delete all accounts using tags like underage, incest, rape, etc. I mean, this was supposed to get rid of the underage porn on the site, which
that happened this year.
They do it but it ended up targeting fan communities instead, and the deletion primarily went after /fanfic communities that had nothing to do with those tags. So like Draco Harry / communities were targeted, fem / communities were targeted. And eventually it was revealed they were working off of a list provided to them by a family values group. And they realized their error. They tried to reinstate the deleted blogs that had been unfairly targeted, but the damage was done. So people basically started migrating to, and Boldthrough happened just after this. And so the fanfiction fandoms started migrating to Archive of Our Own, which is also known as AO3, and Tumblr. In 2008, Archive of Our Own was created. And it was a direct response to all these attacks, and it was conceptualized as a safe space for fanfiction communities that had been marginalized. And then after that, in 2012, to continue on with this history of fanfiction, there was, I'm trying to go as fast as I can for all of this.
It just keeps going.
And then in 2012, there was the biggest and the most controversial fanfiction purge on fanfiction.net. In May of 2012, they started suddenly deleting stories that they were considered too mature for the site. And this is not from the NC-17 rating, but from the M rating. I mean, if you had a swear word in the title of your story or in the summary, in the text, that was enough to get you deleted. And basically, the reasons for the second purge that were given was that it was changing its terms of service, adult language, themes and suggestions were okay, quote unquote. themes and suggestions were okay, but detailed descriptions of violence or sexual content were prohibited. When the purge was done, over 62,000 stories were deleted en masse. Like, they just disappeared and happened so quickly that people didn't have time to save those stories. And some fans blamed this purge on a fanfiction.net subgroup called Critics United. And in the past, they made a concentrated effort to target fics they deemed inappropriate by leaving abusive comments in the review section. And they actually operate very similarly to the anti-fandoms that we have today. They're more like a precursor to them. And this purge was so big that it actually made mainstream news. Like, we'll link it in the show notes, but it actually made it onto mainstream news sites and normie sites. And it was it was really, really big. And then
I can imagine a lot of adults that have participated in that site being very upset that things.
Well, they had grown up with it, right? They had grown up with it. People had grown up with it, and this purge was really wrong. And one of the articles that we'll link was called it the book burning that wasn't. You know,
and this was basically this was prior to Google Docs, and if you didn't have your fic saved on a Word document on your laptop or whatever, like, it was gone. Because I mean, I can only imagine how devastating that would be for so many of those writers and readers who had put all that time into reading or writing a 200,000 word fan fiction, which is longer than some Harry Potter novels, and then for it to just be gone overnight.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking.
Yeah. And then after that purge happened, basically there was this huge mass exodus from fanfiction.net to Archive of Our Own and Tumblr, which is where those sites actually started to tick up big time in traffic. And the fandom basically exists on those sites to this day. Fanfiction.net is still up and running because a lot of older fandoms have the bulk of their fanfics there. Like, that's what they're stuck with, you know, where their readers still go. But rather than going through the hassle, newer fandoms just skip it entirely and go straight to Archive of Our Own as their new stomping ground. And like, that's actually what happened with the Raylo fanfiction, actually. So there is a little bit of Raylo fanfiction on fanfiction.net, but not nearly to the extent as there is an Archive of Our Own as a really good current example. And that is the very, very abridged history of fanfiction. A lot of notes in the actual show notes itself because I had to cut out a ton of it, but that's where we stand right now.
I think that Archive of Our Own is also more attractive and popular with newer fandoms because it's just so much better.
It's really conducive.
It's still running like on the same code, I guess, they had in like the late 90s.
It looks exactly the same as it did in 1998.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really limited functionality in terms of what you can search for. So if you're looking for a very specific type of story, it's really hard to find that on fanfiction.net, but it's really easy on Archive of Our Own because of the tagging and the categorization. Sorry, I don't mean to sound like an advert, but
no,
it's true. It's true, though. The interface is so much more conducive to searching and filtering based on the things that fandom has evolved to, you know, fan over. Like, ships aren't even really so much of a thing on fanfiction.net, but like, you can literally filter on ships on Archive of Our Own.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've only ever used Archive of Our Own because I came to fanfiction pretty recently. And yeah, I've heard about everything that had happened with fanfiction.net before, and I'm just kind of glad I missed all of that drama because there's enough drama already going on in current fandom. But that stuff to actually make it to mainstream media is just frightening.
It was in early fandom, like in early 2000s, fanfiction.net was like the place to be before the purges happened because there was really nothing else out there that was to that extent.
Yeah, there were a couple other spin-off sites that would cater to specific things. Like, I remember, like I've said on this show before, being on animespiral.com, and that was like specific anime fanfiction. But even then, as people branched out of anime, the site didn't have room for really anything else, but fanfiction.net just had this all-encompassing, you know, post anything, post whatever, post your original fiction, whatever, and people just really clung to it.
Yeah, and I'm going to recommend, there's an episode of Imaginary Worlds podcast with one of the creators of Archive of Our Own, who's a lawyer, and
really?
Talking about how it was very much a community effort between quite a few professional people, adults obviously, who, you know, as a response to the fact that there were these purges and this control, because fanfiction.net, I don't even know if you knew this, but like it was like owned by one person. You know, it was like,
yeah.
And he was like a Chinese college student who didn't know what he was getting into because, you know, I don't think anybody could, you know, like see this surge happening. So that's why it was so badly moderated and so badly managed. And the response to that, making that, basically creating AO3 as this haven for people, and again, with the content that was considered scandalous, which was, homosexuality at the time was considered scandalous, which is ridiculous, but we know that now. But like during that period, it was still kind of up in the air for people. And,
at least in the US.
Yeah, so AO3 has definitely been a sanctuary for writers, and because you know that your content is going to be protected.
Yeah.
It's interesting too how, I don't know if we want to talk about like the legality, but like back in the fanfiction.net days, everyone would put disclaimers on their fics because there was a real threat of creators coming after you with lawyers, because it wasn't so much of an established cultural thing, whereas now most people don't do that at all. You don't really see them anymore, except from people who have been writing fan fiction for 20 years.
Thanks, Anne Rice.
I remember that people would try to like outdo each other with their disclaimers. Like everyone would try to be like funny and cute about it and be like, "Oh, I hope that like Garrus won't come and sue me for writing this Labyrinth fan fiction."
Yeah, like I hope Anne Rice doesn't come rappelling down from the ceiling to take me away.
Exactly.
There was that.
Actually,
I was just going to say, no, it's fine. I'll just say it real quick. A huge fear that I had when Disney took over Star Wars fandom was that they would actually go after fan fiction in the Star Wars community, like even worse than it had been before, right? Because you talked about like the letters of cease and desist about porn, right?
Yeah.
But Disney has this like big reputation, or used to have this big reputation of going after people that were doing fan works, right? So I was actually really, really worried that they would go after Star Wars fan fiction, especially the newer Star Wars fan fiction that was coming out. But that hasn't happened yet. So I
don't expect it to happen, actually. I think a lot of it is that we know that the culture has changed quite a bit. They understand that that's kind of a natural evolution of what's come out of, like, say, the Harry Potter fandom, or even, popularity of stuff is like the fan response is measurable by that creative work that they're producing. So.
Right. And it ultimately benefits them. I mean, when people are shipping and writing fic on AO3 or Tumblr, people who wouldn't necessarily have known about said fandom beforehand then find out about it because they see the edits and things like that, and then they get into it and go purchase the source material. So I think ultimately they've realized that it's good for their business.
Yeah, like at the premiere of The Last Jedi yesterday, they had walls filled with fan arts. Obviously, that's different from fan fiction. But it shows that they've got a very open attitude towards fan works and fans engaging creatively with the material, which, like you say, is so different from the climate in the early 2000s when everyone was writing, "I own nothing. What? Little old me."
Yeah, it makes much more sense to me to encourage that creativity in the fandom and have that like back and forth relationship, because it does foster interest and get new people interested in the content. Yeah,
I thought it was really cool that they did feature fan art on the red carpet for The Last Jedi. I think that's pretty insane. I mean, that's cool that they're incorporating fandom so closely, I guess.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't expect that. Kirsty and I we got to watch the premiere or the red carpet together yesterday, and we were like watching an interview with like Donald Gleason or something, and we were like, "Oh, there's fan art behind him. Do we know any of those artists?"
We did recognize a couple of them, so it was really exciting.
Yeah, fan art is, in my opinion, I would say it is a version of fan fiction in itself, right? Like, it definitely has its own kind of sets of tropes and motivators, and, it's participatory with fan fiction. A lot of the times it'll be, people will write fanfic for art or vice versa, and I think it's important to remember that as well. Like, Tumblr has definitely been a mecca for that for a lot of artists.
Yeah, I didn't even realize fan art was such a thing until I got on Tumblr again back in 2015, because like when I was doing fandom stuff, like maybe people would post their own art on their Geocities account, but back in 2002 or whatever, but there wasn't really such a platform for artists to create fan art, even though I'm sure they were, because like I remember
DeviantArt was where most people were. I was on there for about 10 years.
Yeah.
So that was my main experience, but the way that the tagging system worked on there and the sharing and also some of the content policies, like you would not get what you would see on Tumblr today on DeviantArt. Yeah.
I forgot about that.
Oh, no.
I can't art shit because that's not my medium.
They had writing on there, but it was very limited. I was part of the writing community on there, and it was like 5 people all liking each other's stuff. It was nice.
Yeah, I tried to do writing on DeviantArt one time, and it's kind of dead there. It was kind of dead there for that. It was not really the best place to put your stuff.
No.
It was a very visual. It was a very visual medium. So I just kind of gave up on that too, right? But yeah, no, it was Tumblr has been, despite its issues, Tumblr has definitely been like a mecca for fandom and fan fiction and fan art. And to be honest with you, I think that makes up like, I don't know, half the site these days, right? Like it wasn't like that in the beginning. Like there was more of an even split between the different types of groups that congregated on Tumblr.
But now it's just like you're either a meme blog or a fandom blog, basically,
Or
an
a porn
aesthetic
blog.
Or yeah, they are the other half.
I like the aesthetic blogs though, especially the vaporwave ones. I'll cut that part, but
I love the vaporwave ones. Have you guys seen them? God, they're gorgeous. They're just amazing blogs.
pastel pictures with Japanese text and
Yeah.
sorry. Okay. So I would like to transition this into maybe a discussion of our personal experiences with fandom and with fan fiction. And I would like to start with our guests. So Kirsty or Rachel, which one of you would like to go?
Why don't you go first, Kirsty?
Okay.
So generous.
I'm relatively new to fanfiction because I read a little bit of Harry Potter fic and Annie Dahlia fic when Attack of the Clones came out as a teenager, but I only lurked, like I just kind of stumbled across it and then didn't write it myself or contribute to any communities in any meaningful way. And then I just kind of forgot that it existed for years.
Yeah.
Until The Force Awakens came out and I started engaging with the fandom in general on like the main Star Wars forums. And then because of, well, you guys know everything that went down on how people were not comfortable talking about certain aspects of the story, it kind of drove you to places like Tumblr and Archive of Our Own to engage with fandom on that level with the parts that we were interested in. So yeah, that's kind of my perception of fandom. So like all of this, the history stuff is fascinating to me because I just missed out on all of that. And there's still a lot of drama in fandom, but it sounds like it's nothing compared to what's happened before. But I've fallen in love with fanfiction since The Force Awakens because I basically got impatient. I didn't want to wait 2 years to find out what happens next. I wanted to see how other people were engaging with these characters, if they'd loved the story for similar reasons to my own. And it's just been really cool to be part of that community and make friends through it and engage with other people in a creative way. So yeah, that's kind of where I've been coming from. So I read a lot of fan fiction now, but I'm still relatively new to it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, what you're saying, Kirsty, about the history being really interesting, I thought that as well, because I used these sites like when I was younger. Like I used fanfiction.net a lot and I wrote fanfiction and put it up there as well. But I wasn't fully aware of the extent of all the drama, and I didn't know that Archive of Our Own was a thing because of drama on fanfiction.net and other sites. So that was really interesting. But yeah, as for how I got into fanfiction, sorry. Oh God, this is going to be so confessional. The first fanfiction I ever read was probably My Little Pony fanfiction when I was a child.
Nice.
So this is like in the late 90s. And I was watching all the VHS tapes of the 80s, like My Little Pony cartoons, and for whatever reason I was fascinated.
I was too.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. And I'm not alone. And I just needed more ponies. So yeah, I was on like City sites and read it there. Can you guys remember Web Wings? Oh, God.
I never saw that.
No, I haven't. No.
I remember it.
Oh, thank you. It's a system where there were like groups of sites and they were all linked by something. So it'd be like My Little Pony Fanfiction Alliance.
Mm-hmm.
And then it would all be like My Little Pony fanfiction websites in this web ring.
Yeah, I remember those. I remember those really vividly. They were a staple of that era, actually. And
I do remember being like when I was like probably 12 or whatever, I got really into like HTML coding, and it was a big thing to create your own Angel Fire account for your own fandom, basically, and curate your own miniature fandom site rather than, just creating a blog like we do now on platforms like Tumblr.
Yeah, I had one for, I think I had either a GeoCities or Angel Fire account, and I had Dragon Ball Z stuff.
Mine was Nirvana, the band.
I'm pretty sure I made a My Little Pony website.
Nice.
I don't think that still exists. Thank God.
Thank goodness.
So yeah, don't go digging, anyone, please. I don't think
I can't even find my episodes. You're not going to find it.
Yeah, exactly. Hopefully it's long since been eliminated, purged. Yeah, but when I got a bit older, so when I was like in my mid-teens, I got really into Labyrinth. And I was into Labyrinth fandom in a really hardcore way for, God, like the best part of a decade. I still love Labyrinth. I always will. But I'm the kind of person where I struggle to have more than one like big fandom at a time. Mm-hmm. So it would just be unhealthy if I were into something with the same intensity that I'm into Star Wars right now. Mm-hmm. Like I couldn't be into Star Wars to this extent and also be into, I don't know, like Hannibal or something, mm-hmm. because there's just not that much mind space, So mm-hmm. I tend to jump from thing to thing. Not that I'm thinking I'm going to jump from Star Wars anytime soon. I really, really don't. It's like Star Wars is like the ultimate fandom. But yeah, with Labyrinth, I was into that for a long time, and I wrote and read a lot of fan fiction. And I actually found Labyrinth fandom really interesting, and it made me like conscious of like the power of fandom and stuff in a way that I never was before, because yeah, I didn't feel like empowered by My Little Pony fan fiction. But with Labyrinth fan fiction, it's interesting because Labyrinth is a film about a teenaged girl, but there was this real gap in terms of what was being provided officially from the Henson Company mm-hmm. about that property. And basically Sarah, so the main character of the original film, she was being ignored. You could not, and you still can't, get any Sarah merchandise, essentially, which is bullshit in my opinion.
Total bullshit.
It's total bullshit.
And like they did a sequel to Labyrinth, like a pseudo manga sequel. It wasn't real manga because it was done by like a Western artist and a Western author, but they wanted to do it that way because it was cool and marketable in the mid 2000s. Mm-hmm. But instead of having the hero of that manga be Sarah, they made the hero of the manga be Sarah's baby brother, who is now a teenager.
Oh my God.
So freaking furious. And that just like intensified this desire to like fight back and be even more passionate about creating these stories and these fan works about Labyrinth that were all from Sarah's perspective, and like focusing on the female experience of the world of that film, because yeah, it certainly wasn't coming to us from up top, so we had to do it ourselves basically. So yeah, I felt that as like a movement in a big way. And yeah, so once like Labyrinth fandom had kind of run its course for me, I kind of got into Jupiter Ascending mm-hmm. for really hardcore for like a year. And then, like the traitor that I am, I got into Star Wars mega hardcore. And that brings us up very crazy. So yeah, I'm sure we'll probably talk more about Star Wars fan fiction and fandom. So yes. Yeah, I'll stop now.
No, but that's really inspiring to hear about how the reaction within the Labyrinth community was basically just to create more, and I distinctly remember that time period for the comics that were coming out, because I am an old person, not really old, but older than most of you. And it was definitely very much centered on the male gaze, even if it had a female lead, right? I mean, I think of stuff like the Top Cow comics, like Witchblade and stuff that was coming out, where you're like, yeah, it has so much potential, and yeah, no. So, yeah. Sorry,
I feel like that has to have been how Star Wars fandom was before The Force Awakens as well, because the little of the Anadala fiction that I read, a lot of what I chose to read was from Padme's perspective more, because I feel like that is what's missing from the narrative, which makes sense because Anakin is the protagonist. But, as a young woman watching that was what I wanted to find. So
exactly.
Yeah, I got into fan fiction through Inuyasha in probably like 2002 or so, and started writing that. And I was a terrible, terrible writer, but
we all were.
But fan fiction's been great for me because I never would have written anything if it weren't. I mean, I guess maybe that's not true, but like it really gave me a platform to develop my writing and to meet other writers. Like I think one thing that I absolutely love about the fanfiction community is this whole concept of beta readers and editors.
Mm-hmm.
And so you will write these stories and then you meet other people in your fandom that are interested in them, and they want to either collaborate with you on a fanfiction or they'll beta read it and give you suggestions for edits. And I think like when I first started writing, I was just writing these garbage, like pseudo comedy script format pieces of trash that I thought were funny, but like definitely nobody else did. And then one of my friends that I met through the Inuyasha fandom in the early 2000s wanted to collaborate on a Wolf's Rain fanfiction with me, and she was an incredible writer compared to me, and we would collaborate by writing on these Microsoft Word documents and emailing them back and forth, and just seeing her style, it really influenced my own, and she would give me suggestions. She was so generous. She would teach me about grammar and things like that, and she still left a lot to be desired, of course, but she elevated my writing capabilities, tenfold. And then getting back into writing fan fiction 2 years ago, it's definitely developed my writing more so to the point where now I'm working on an original novel, which I never would have been able to 10 years ago,
That's so true. I met one of my absolute best friends because she read one of my stories and volunteered to beta read it for me. And we've been like best friends for about 10 years now. And she's American, and we would not have met if we had not both been into fan fiction at that specific time. Mm-hmm. And that's so lovely. And yeah, it was exactly the same kind of thing. She's very like meticulous about grammar and spelling and phrasing, and she would sometimes absolutely tear my writing apart, like because she was so critical.
Yeah,
but it made me such a better writer, and yeah, it was so like formative and helpful because without the skills that I learned through writing fan fiction, I wouldn't have written anything else. And yeah, that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the best parts about fandom and fan fiction in general is that it has no boundaries whatsoever, right? Like, we are able to be an interconnected international community. Most of the people that I know on Tumblr are not American, are not, and have different experiences, but we all can align over the same love for the content.
Mm-hmm.
So, Shai, did you want to explain where you started?
Sure. I have a very long history with fanfiction, so I'm going to try to condense it a lot. Oh, shoot.
I wonder if I should go first since mine sucks. That's right. Go ahead.
Maybe it's better if you actually go first, right? Because I've just been involved with, Rachel will be similar to you in that it's a bit confessional for me, and that I've been involved with fandom and fanfiction for so long that it's just like, I have a little bit of a lingering shame associated with how long I've been involved with it.
Oh.
No shame.
Can I also just interject real quick?
Absolutely.
Do you guys, like, I saw this post one time. It's like a pretty high noted post on Tumblr, but that feeling when I was first reading fan fiction back in the day, it was in the days when households had one computer, and there was an office and there was a computer, and you had to, share the computer with other people in your household. And I remember just that gut sinking feeling of like my father coming into the office and saying, "What are you reading?" And that just, you're like, you're in the headlight. You're just like, "Oh, it's an online book," Like, I remember. Like, no way in hell am I going to tell you what I'm actually reading because you would be horrified.
I remember when I was writing fan fiction as like a child, as I was like 11 or 12, and like doing this on like a really ancient like PC that I'm sure like modern teenagers wouldn't even recognize as a computer. And like, because the whole family shared the same computer, as you've been saying, I remember my genius idea was to create like a really complicated filing structure. So I have folders within folders within folders within folders. And I'd like bury fan fiction at like the bottommost layer.
I did that too. Really? Yes, I did that too. I would create secret folders that I would name like homework or something like that, and just bury it.
Oh my god, this is so amazing.
Actually, there was one time my dad found it. He found it and he sent it to our family email mailing list because he was like, "I'm so proud of her." And then they all just read my Full Metal Alchemist shame, and I still get red in the cheeks when I think about that.
Oh no!
Oh my god!
Actually, I can leverage this because I actually had I had exact same experience. We had a family computer and a family shared email address, and I made the mistake of getting involved with RP groups.
Yes, me too.
Yeah, and when your stepfather finds the email from somebody trying to RP something sexual with you that you didn't actually initiate, and then responds back. Oh god. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean I grew up not very participatory in fandom because I again started out before the internet was, I think, truly reached, was accessible. So, for me and my friends, we basically would share fanfic that we found online, but we wouldn't typically have a site that we would go to, or we didn't have the computers to actually access it or the internet connections. So, I mean, a lot of it was just, I think my group of friends and I were really big on self-insert, right? We wrote stories, we put ourselves in the stories, we put our friends in the stories, or we modified the characters to be us. And, it was sort of one of those really, I think I called it masturbatory last time I podcasted about it, periods of my life. But, we're virgin junior high and high school girls that don't really, have any interest in high school guys. So that was sort of the way that we did it. We read a lot of comics, we watched a lot of movies, but, every week we'd have some new thing. I mean, we loved everything as long as it had female characters and a female narrative. We even did Charlie's Angels fanfic at one point, if you can believe it. But it was just shared between us and it was never posted online. So I spent a lot of time away from fandom as it missed some of these periods, but I was writing with my group of friends for a long time and taking a lot of inspiration from the content around me. And I definitely fell back into the mess with The Force Awakens, as Kirsty, you said that you did as well. And, you bring back, it actually it's a little bit of a nostalgia bump for me because I just, brings back happy memories of reading Sailor Moon fan fiction or, or reading, oh God, we had some, or Final Fantasy fan fiction. Actually, I'm writing Final Fantasy fan fiction right now because I was so inspired by a recent fic that I read. So yeah, it's definitely been a creative bump for me, even though sometimes I feel like, yes, you're in your 30s. This is kind of, people always want to think it's juvenile, but I really don't. After spending the last few years in fandom, I've had this newfound appreciation because I think it's really a revolutionary and almost mimetic way of telling stories, right? This is our folklore and our fairy tales for a modern age. This is how we relate this information, our shared interest in this content. It's how we basically create now. So.
And I love the breadth of age in fandom. I didn't really realize because I'm in my 20s, but there's women whose fan fiction I read that are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and I think that's really, really cool that there are people who are, just bridges generational gaps, I guess, because you all just still have this common interest, and it shows that, being a woman in your 20s and versus being a woman in your 50s, there's still just, such a common ground to be found, and it's nice having that sense of community or whatever.
Yeah.
Every now and then I come across a post on Tumblr that's attacking older women in fandom.
Oh, I hate that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's this idea of anyone who's in fandom, and it's always an arbitrary age, probably depending on the original poster. Yeah. If they're a teenager, they think mid-20s is old, or sometimes 30 is the cutoff. But whatever it is, it's those people older than that boundary that they've set are creepy and shouldn't be in fandom, and they're irresponsible for writing content that isn't catered to minors. And it's just fandom has been
built
around
your kingdom.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Those women who are older now, they built it, and they built it at a time when it was not welcome. It's still not, but it was even worse then, from what it sounds like. So there's a lot of casual ageism I see thrown around, and it's so gross.
Yeah. And I think one of the best points that I've kind of figured out over the years is that essentially there is no difference between fan fiction and writing within a universe that's shared. So if you think about comics industry or Star Trek or Star Wars, all of these, professional writers now definitely started in those fan communities because you have to know the canon in order to create a transformative work. And because you have that shared knowledge of it, right? And so the people that really, the people that really excel at this are the people that have the most experience with it. And, and not to say that new writers or young writers aren't good as well, but it's just that you find that the more context people have and the more experience they have with it, I just feel like, those are the people that you need to protect because they're the ones that are going to be defining canon as it goes on.
Yeah, I mean, we know that some of the writers in the new Star Wars canon started out with fan fiction. Claudia Gray is probably the most well-known example, but I'm sure lots of them have written fan fiction before.
Yeah, I think Delilah
because, like you
Dawson
say,
did, right?
oh yeah, I think so. Because, like you say, you have to know the world. You have to know the characters and the tropes and the history of. Even if you haven't written fan fiction, you've for sure read it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean it does translate into publishing for sure, because like Cassandra Clare and who's the 50 Shades author, E.L. James. Yeah, I mean a lot of those works like were heavily inspired by fan fiction, and like they got their reader base. So I've heard. I wasn't active in those fandoms, but word on the street is, they got massive reader bases from writing in Twilight fan fiction in the Twilight fandom or Twilight or Harry Potter fandom, and you can, definitely translate those readers from Archive of Our Own into book deals if you
absolutely.
do it right.
And one of the things that I'm on the Wikipedia page for fan fiction right now, and basically saying that J.K. Rowling and Stephanie Meyer, which are Cassandra Clare was Harry Potter, right?
Yeah.
So those two authors are actually very supportive of fan fiction, and were sharing their, basically sharing their love for that work, and that, creating that inclusive community for their fans, and allowing them to have that, all of this sort of transformative nature to it. And Stephanie Meyer even put links on her website to fan fiction sites. So, that is how you build a reputation, is if you are online and you're part of this larger fandom and you're contributing to it. And if the creators like it, oh my God, think of all like the rush of happiness that's been going on with Star Wars that are liking fan art on Instagram and Twitter and Tumblr. Or not Tumblr, obviously. If they're on Tumblr, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
They might be.
They might be. I can see Daisy being on there for sure.
Brian Johnson has a Tumblr.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, he does literally have a Tumblr. He occasionally posts stuff, but it's like photos of him doing cool things, like editing the movie.
No, I think actually one thing I should bring up is just because I've been involved with fan fiction and stuff for so long, is one thing I really like now is how much the landscape for fan fiction has changed. How it is no longer a mark of shame if you are into transformative fiction, like it is becoming. It is now becoming like we still have problems. There's still issues. I don't think we'll ever get away from all those issues. But now people are more accepting in the mainstream of fan fiction. People know what fan fiction are. And fan fiction is being used as a segue for people to essentially get a voice among all these different writers and all these different franchises in order to become professional if they wish to, right? Or to just exist in the fandom space. And there's a lot more freedom that way. And I think this is a really, really positive narrative and a positive trajectory from where we were before, where they would literally send the lawyers after little old you sitting in the basement, right? Like a My Little Pony fanfic.
Yeah, we're going to make so much money from these 12-year-olds.
So I really like how they basically said, okay, this is not actually going to hurt our business. This is actually going to help, right? For me personally, like Aaron, I'm also writing original fiction right now. Fingers crossed I'll be able to get it published. But if I do, I think fan fiction is such a compliment. I personally, if someone loves your canon to the point where they want to continue it, or create their own expanded universe off of it, right? Like that tells me that there's an investment there in the characters, that they care on some level. And I think that is a wonderful thing, that sort of collaborative, transformative ability of fan fiction in all its forms.
Absolutely. And I think that's also kind of showing a shift and change in the way that the interactions between creators and the fans. And additionally, I also think it's a shift in how women are treated in fandom, to be honest with you, because I think a lot of the derogative nature of fan fiction before was that women were writing it and that it was considered however you want to slut shame, women in fandom about, writing fic about or whatever, basically, I'm going to rephrase that. I shouldn't say slut shame on my podcast.
The women are really important to transformative fiction, right? Like my history with fan fiction is really long. We don't really need to get into that. Too long to read is I've been doing it for too long. I'd rather talk about the transformative power of women in fan fiction, right? Like because we are important to it, right? Like there is, so like, because fan fiction is predominantly written by women for other women, both queer and straight, and it deals heavily with the female gaze, whether the characters are female or not, and how that's extrapolated from male-dominated franchises. So it's really important for women to share these narratives that are important to them. It was important for me when I was younger, when I was growing up, and when I was in fan fiction, because when I first got into fan fiction, in a nutshell, it allowed me to work through like complex feelings that there was no other guide for. Like it wasn't being explored in mainstream media, even books that were supposedly for me, that were like, geared towards girls, were toned down, that didn't really explain stuff in the way that made sense to me. And fan fiction burst past that and basically said, this is what the female experience is, in a way that wasn't being spoken to me anywhere else. And it still does that, and that's part of the reason why it's so popular online. And within this space, as we talked about, like with the professional realm, women can explore their creativity. And they can also hone their skills into becoming a professional writer if they want, in an area that they are not being judged by male standards, basically. So you've got your beta readers who are like, helping you along to improve your stories, instead of a guy saying, oh, this is stupid because it's about a girl, right?
Yeah.
Or what a girl wants, right? So like that was really powerful.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a shift in general in like as people are finally waking up to the fact that why are there so few women screenwriters? Why are there so few women major comic book writers? Like there's this idea that, we've been kind of forced into this channel of creating work for each other and ourselves, not being able.
Yeah, because none of these stories, they're starting to, but it's so hard to find media that caters to women. And so we love all these canon verses, like Star Wars, Star Trek, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, whatever, but so many of these stories that we get that are so cool, that are so culturally relevant, they still just don't really speak to the experience of women and female gaze. And so we take it offline and go to fan fiction to get what we are craving.
I should also add that I think fan fiction needs to be protected to a certain degree. The fact that it's been continuously shat on by men and people in positions of power. Things are changing now, but because the fact that it's been shat on by men and people in positions of power up until this point, because it operates outside their cultural control, is telling. And I think that it needs to be protected as a space for women to write. That said, I think fan fiction still has its downsides. Like we've been talking really about the positive aspects of fan fiction for quite some time now, right? But there are some downsides to it. Like my personal experience with fan fiction has been actually really, really rewarding and positive. I've never really had a bad experience with it, but I've heard from many other people that it sometimes gets them down. Like it's not even a conceited, like their writing doesn't get as much attention as they want, and it's not even a conceited thing when they say this. It's more like the age-old dilemma of the creator. So, when you're writing online or you're screaming into the void, who are you screaming to, right? Like, is anyone else listening or reading that? And because there's so much fan fiction, sometimes a lot of fics don't get a lot of attention for that too. And I empathize with the fact that you're writing, but there's no one actually reading those stories, right? Even within this transformative phase that is for women, some narratives get more attention than others. And there's also this kind of like ugly side to fan fiction where people, at least these days, I can't remember if it used to be like that when I was younger because I wasn't really tuned into it that much, where people compete to see who can be the best writer. And it can get a little bit vicious. And I personally think that's a little bit stupid because there's so many fanfic readers and they're voracious. And if you put your fic out there, eventually someone's going to read it. So, the pie is huge. We can all be great writers together. We can all have all these readers together. And that's the power of transformative fiction. But I feel like sometimes people forget that.
Yeah, I think it's important to look at it not as a popularity contest as much as it is of course, there are going to be people that put out stuff and are underappreciated always. It's a matter of visibility and how much you are part of the community, right? I don't expect kudos on my fanfic if I didn't really actually tell anybody about it because I was embarrassed by it when But I got it out there. So I think looking at it more as in a sense of community and less of a power structure is important. And I think that's actually something that has more to do with the socialization that women go through and the way that we interact with each other, right? We're a little bit more egalitarian. We're not trying to make it a pissing contest like who's the better at getting canon out or who's the better AU or who has the best coffee shop. We're very collaborative in that sense. I would think, and that's just my view on it.
I do typically find it quite a supportive environment. Like obviously there's nastiness as there is anywhere on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
But I think for the most part, it's like a positive thing, and it's people
Mhm.
like trying to help each other. Like if I read a story where I don't think much of it, I'll typically just move on. Like I won't like leave a nasty comment. And if I feel like there's something constructive I could say that might help that person out, then I would say it, and I'll try to be nice about it. And I do think that's typically what people do. I might be being too optimistic.
No, I agree. And I think that, like, I remember back in, like, fanfiction.net days, like, being afraid of flames, as they're called, like, bad reviews, was such a real fear. And maybe that's just because my writing was so bad. I don't know. But, but I mean, but people, like, would really go out of their way to write really nasty reviews on fictions they didn't like. And now I think, I mean, most people just don't even take the time to leave a comment. But if they do, it's because they felt so compelled because they liked it so much, or they, you know, they need to tell the author what they liked so they can feel appreciated.
Speaking of bad fanfics. Oh, sorry, continue.
I was going to agree that I don't see much negativity, at least like within a fandom or a sub-fandom. A lot of the negativity seems to come like from shipping wars and stuff like that, where people don't like the pairing as opposed to the actual writing, or use that bad
now
quality writing as like an excuse.
Now people just run hate blogs instead of instead of going out of their way to find those things.
I think it's changed a bit, actually, because when I was younger, back when our fanfiction.net was the biggest thing out there was more flames, actually. But I think that's because people didn't have as many places to run their hate blogs, essentially, right? Like, you know, these flame wars would start in the comment section. And while I never actually got them on my stories itself, like I would go into the reviews section on the reviews on a story for fanfiction.net, and you could always tell if there was a flame war going on if there was very few favorites to a story, but tons of comments.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You know? And that's how you could tell if the story was getting flamed, and you go in and you just see all these comments. And there was one actually infamous fic which was the flame war was so big it turned into, like, you know, a sort of a cultural standpoint for fan fiction, which was that Harry Potter fanfic My Immortal. Have you guys ever read My Immortal?
Yeah.
Oh, I know of it.
Yeah. Should we talk about My Immortal? We should give an honorable mention to this story. So My Immortal is basically it was written by, I think her name is Tara Gillespie or something like that. I think that's her name. It was a Harry Potter fanfic that came out in the early aughts, and this girl had written a Harry Potter story where everyone was gothic. You know, it was everyone
like
was
scene kids. You know, it was during it was definitely during the
scene era. Yeah. They were scene gothic, right? And you know, there was
well, first of all, she's a self-insert. Her name is Raven Darkness Dementia Way. You know,
here's the opening paragraph. Hi, my name is Ebony Darkness, and darkness is apostrophed between dark and ness. Ebony Darkness Dementia Ravenway, and I have long ebony black hair. That's how I got my name, with purple streaks and red tips that reaches my mid-black and icy blue eyes like limpid tears. And a lot of people tell me I look like Amy Lee.
Wow. Hasn't it been said that was a troll fic? I don't know if that's true.
Okay,
I am a true believer.
People keep showing up and being like, "Oh, I wrote My Immortal and I was trolling." I don't believe any of it.
I want to believe. I
think it's a real fic. To be honest, it just achieved notoriety, but people are trying. See, the thing with My Immortal, right, is like, we'll link it in the show notes. There's the original author disappeared years ago, quote unquote, disappeared years ago, but there's mirrors of the story everywhere. And it's this cultural touchstone of fan fiction. We will definitely link it in the show notes. I think everyone should read it because it's one of those things that is so bad it's good.
It's like the room of fan fiction.
Yeah, pretty much.
They have celebrity readings of it. Yeah, so it is definitely the room of fanfic. Yeah.
They have celebrity readings. There's web series of it. There's comics. It's so much. And I remember actually being on the site when it first came out, and everyone was talking about it, and everyone was trying to figure out, is this a troll? It has to be a troll, right? But like, to be honest with you, I don't think it's a troll because it reads like the sort of fan fiction that you get from a certain type of girl at a certain type of age. Who I was
like, it seems like trolling now, and I guess it did then too, but like there were people really talking like that all over the internet back then.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. It was not that far-fetched. And nowadays I guess people are cynical about that, but it was just like, Oh gosh, it was such a. I love it for what it is. But the Flame Wars used to be worse, and now it's shifted a bit. And I don't think it's nearly to the extent that they used to have the Flame Wars, because they've got stuff like Tumblr and Twitter to vent their rage.
I think that, and now it's just anti-shipping blogs and lots of shade and wank being thrown into the tags in Tumblr.
And passive-aggressive gifs.
Yep. I love that. Passive-aggressive gifting is like our age's like gossipy catty response.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
I'm particularly glad to see that there's not personal attacks typically.
Of course.
But at the same token, we've definitely entered an era where we do have to be very careful about our identities, because these people, some of the people are, we can say that like the anti-shippers some of them are relatively unhinged and do actually threaten people. And I know there's been cases of real world harassment and violence. The Harry Potter fandom was a good example of that. There was this woman on the forums that basically stalked and harassed one of the major fandoms people. And again, another Imaginary Worlds podcast I recommend you guys listen to.
Wow.
There's a lot of danger putting yourself out there, and I think and especially since we see that most of the people in these movements of anti-shipping seem to be younger. Like, there's just still figuring out things. They don't really have a lot of real-world experience, and so they start projecting a lot of these value judgments and moral judgments on people. And sometimes it's very hypocritical, obviously. We've seen a lot of that, because it's very much just like they replaced the religious right, you know. All your grandparents that are too old to be on the internet anyway, you know, that had really conservative feelings about stuff in the 90s have now been replaced by 13-year-olds who think that anyone the age 18 shipped is pedophilia. So
there's one actually interesting thing now that we're sort of on the topic that I should bring up too, is one thing I've noticed about fan fiction from like the early aughts versus fan fiction now is, so the early aughts fan fiction was kind of basically like anything goes in terms of subject matter, right?
Yeah, I remember like one of the most famous fics. I was just thinking that like there was a fic I read one time, and it's a pretty famous one, but Hogwarts and the Giant Squid, and like that's total crack. But you know, like there was no outrage about that or any of the things that would, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if that would be deemed problematic now, probably in some spheres, but it was just totally okay to just write the crackiest stuff, and people.
Yeah, there's another Harry Potter fanfic I remember from that age where Dobby the house elf has a crush on Hagrid, and they have graphic sex in this fic.
Things I never wanted to imagine ever.
I have the link. I remember. Anyway, my it was very graphic, and I will never hear the words, you know, "Oh, Dobby" again. Like, like everything was kind of like, you know, anything goes within fan fiction, right?
Yeah.
However, in the current era of fan fiction, even though we have hyper-specific tagging systems on AO3 now that allow you to really curate your experience, even though that is improved, there's been like this, it's almost a slide backwards where, you know, you can only write fan fiction about certain things. It's like this Victorian puritanism. And, you know, if you can only write certain tropes. You can't write other things. It's funny to say, but we talk about Star Wars a lot because it's something that we all have in common. And we've talked about the Reylo ship before. The Too Long Didn't Read, for people that are not familiar with it, is so Reylo is Kylo Ren and Rey. There's a segment of people that think they are cousins or brother and sister.
And there's also very many people from shipping things, by the way.
No, it doesn't. But there's a whole anti-movement against that.
We've talked about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
we've talked about it quite frequently. But in terms of fan fiction, people are saying you can't write fan fiction of these two because they're cousins, or they're supposedly related, right? Where it's not. That would never have stopped anyone back in the day, right, from writing, this ship with two pairs of cousins, right? As I just mentioned, there was like fics out there where Hagrid and Dobby the house elf, fuck violently in a closet. So like, there has been a shift in what is considered appropriate and what's not. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. That's definitely true. There's much more moral policing now than there used to be. Like,
Yeah.
like for example, with Labyrinth, like the main ship in Labyrinth is obviously Jareth and Sarah.
Mhm.
And as a mature adult, I appreciate that there are all kinds of troubling
Yeah.
things associated with that, because you have 14-year-old Jennifer Connelly and 38-year-old David Bowie. I don't think I need to say much else about how problematic that is.
Right.
But I don't recall conversations about, oh God, this is so problematic. What the F?
I
Going
can't
on.
like this.
Yeah, exactly. That just didn't enter people's minds back then. And I think that's very much zeitgeisty as well. People are much more conscious of like morality and how that applies to media and fandom and stuff. And I think to an extent that's a really good thing, because I think part of that movement is why like slash shipping, like that isn't a problem anymore in the way it was in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
So I think in many ways it's been really great and it's a good thing. But yeah, it's just sometimes it crosses a line and it results in this whole new cycle of bullying and like pearl clutching, and yeah, sometimes it's bullshit, basically.
Yeah, the pearl clutching. We make fun of that a lot, but it's very true. And too, you know, the whole point of fan fiction is that it's transformative. So most of the people, when they were shipping, say, you know, like an age gap or a teacher-student kind of thing, lots of fandoms have it. They do it in a way that is transformative and healthy for the character, typically. And if they don't, that's fine. They also just always tag it and like make sure that it's, you know, spelled out. This is something that I like. You might not like it, but I'm writing about it. I don't think that there should be any judgment. You know, my kink is not your kink. I think allowing people to, that's something that I had to get over, because back when I was in college, there was this, you know, popular site called Topless Robot that had a fan fiction Friday where they would basically make fun of fan fiction, and they actually shut it down because they realized it was kind of cruel, because the people that were, you know, like it's not fair to. Some of this is really funny because, you know, if you're going to have a fan fiction about Winnie the Pooh or the Transformers, you know, with golden showers, which I. Then yeah, it's inherently funny and disgusting, and you know, you want to laugh about it. But it's also like there are people out there that have certain interests and kinks, and you know, they're not practicing them in real life. They're exploring them in fiction because that's the only avenue for them. And I know that there's a lot of morality and a lot of, you know, there's definitely an ethical question around some of this stuff. But in terms of fiction, and just fiction in general, I don't feel like we should be actively policing each other in that environment. Not unless it's something where it's being published and being, I don't know what your guys' opinions on that are, but I'm pretty not libertarian. I'm pretty liberal about that.
No, I'm with you. I don't understand. The biggest thing for me is I don't understand why anyone would want to spend their free time policing strangers on the internet.
Yeah.
I just don't understand why that would be considered a worthwhile use of your time. But also, yeah, it is fiction. And that is a place where people can explore whatever. And, you know, writing something is not necessarily an endorsement of that thing. That seems to be a concept that people struggle with. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just don't. I'm ship and let ship. Any subject matter I think is probably game in fiction. Like, I just don't, because you do get into this slippery slope issue of censorship. And it sounds like there have been times in fandom history where it's gotten dangerously close to just destroying communities.
Well, that's the problem that I'm running into right now, is the current generation of aunties don't realize that what they are doing is the exact same sort of trend that we saw in the early aughts with the religious right, who were going after fan fiction, you know, as the new great source of evil, or one more source of evil. And it is a form of censorship. And there's this loss of institutional memory of what happens when you go down that route. Like fandom has already been down that route. It was awful, you know, like I lived through it, you know, and I never want to go back to those periods of like shame and like not being able to access a site about like, okay, like fics that were like innocuous as a girl falling into Middle Earth and like picking up a bow and fighting, you know, the Dark Lord was considered on the same level as porn. I wasn't allowed to read that at like the public library because it was considered problematic, you know, like that is what, and what the current generation of aunties don't realize is that, you know, plays into that whole idea where, you know, where if women are over a certain age, you know, they shouldn't be in fandom anymore, you know. Well, we built that kingdom for you. We went through all this so that you can write your current ships and have much more freedom with it, you know, so you can have much more freedom with your slash ships. You can have much more freedom with writing fan fiction in general. where fanfiction is now mainstream, like it is much more mainstream than it used to be before. Like fandom in general is mainstream. Like it is now seen as the mark of being, socially accepted to be part of a fandom or interested in a fandom, even just casually, than not. Like if someone says to you, if you are you're a certain age right now, and you say, I'm not really into Star Wars, everyone looks at you kind of weird. So
Haley, our friend Haley, she was telling me that her little sister, who's 14, so she's just now in high school, and earlier this year they had Fandom Day where everybody in 9th grade just dressed up, like basically cosplayed their favorite fandom. And I'm like, that is a whole other world to me,
Yeah.
Wow, that sounds so cool.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that, since I was like bullied in junior high for liking anime. So yeah. I'm glad it's going mainstream.
I was just going to say, I think that it probably is much more accepted and popular among the younger generation now. So like people who are currently teens. But I do think that it's still not so much of a thing for like slightly older people, so people in their 20s. Obviously, there's a lot of us.
Agreed.
But like the people I work with, like none of them even come close to understanding my interest in Star Wars and the intensity of my interest in Star Wars.
Yeah, I get
like,
that too.
Most of them aren't even really interested in seeing the movie in theaters. Yeah, so I was really just wondering if you guys had that experience as well.
I get that experience at work. Like I don't talk about, and part of that is the industry in which I work. It doesn't attract people that have eclectic interests, but I try not to talk about it too much and I definitely don't tell people, even in my friend circle. I think I'm a lot more involved in the internet and like online communities and fandom than most people I know. And so I try to rein it in because I do catch judgment for it.
Yeah.
I don't catch any, actually. For me, it's like, but it's also the industry that I work in, because I work in the creative industry, right? And they actually know, like my work actually knows that I write fan fiction.
Oh, wow.
And they know about my blog. Yeah. So it's not really, for me, it's actually pretty liberating because I don't really have to hide anything. So for me, I've been really lucky that way. It wasn't always that way, but it definitely plays into the industry that I'm working in, right? So
yeah.
I've been really, really lucky that way. I mean, in terms of like, personal relationships, my family knows about it too, right? Like my dad inducted me into the Star Wars fandom when I was a toddler. So yeah, I've been in fandom for a long, that's part of the thing. Because it's I when you grow up with a family that is already into that sort of thing, so there's a little bit, not much just judgment there too. And like my mother also knows about the podcasting and the blog and the fan fiction. She doesn't understand it, but she's supportive of it, which is great. So I don't experience too much real world discrimination towards it. But again, that is just situational, and I know that's not always the case.
Yeah.
How about you guys?
I pretty much keep fandom and personal life separate. Sometimes the podcast gets brought up with people and then I kind of have to talk about it a little bit, but I don't really enjoy it because then you go down a rabbit hole and then some people listen to it and just think, whoa, this is like way deeper than I had anticipated, and I like Star Wars, but not to that degree.
Yes.
So I just prefer people not to know about it. But
yeah, like I don't bring it up typically unless I know the other person already likes Star Wars. Like I'll mention it, so like if I'm going to the premiere, people around me will probably know because it's hard to not talk about something like that.
Mhm.
But I do my absolute best to try and just shut up about it because I know people aren't interested.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat. I have a lot of friends that are really into the subject matter, but I don't understand the level of the depths that we've plumbed since the Force Awakens came out. And it's hard for me to shut up about it. So I typically am very coy, and I usually just ask them a series of leading questions about whether they think Rey is a Skywalker or not, and then I judge them. And then
Nice.
And then sometimes people want to know a little bit more, and I'll talk to them about it. But I mean, I've tried to avoid associating myself with necessarily anything besides, just being very open about the fact that I'm part of this fandom and, all aspects of it, shipping, writing fan fiction, that stuff. Yeah, you can get some bad responses to it, but I typically find they come up from a place of like naivety on the subject. And once it's
people just being unaware that this whole world exists.
Yeah. And then if you the best responses I've gotten are from younger people. Like even my little sister. My little sister was been a Star Wars fan just like I've been for a long time because my mom got us into it. So she's been going on the same trajectory arc that we are, and she's actually texting me about spoilers right now, like freaking out because she's going through the same reactions. Like, oh my god, what's gonna happen? And so you know, and realizing that, and you know, so it took away that like feeling of shame that I kind of internalized from my male fanboy friends, you know. But you know, their interest and love of the content is no different than ours. We just express it differently. So yeah. So sadly, Erin had to leave, but we will be continuing this conversation. And the next thing that we kind of want to talk about is somehow, so I think we touched upon this earlier, the fact that fan fiction is often is almost considered a slur sometimes in the way that people talk about it online. And then also why women's contributions to speculation, as we've experienced, are deemed fanfic, whereas men's are not. And I think the best people to talk about this is Kirsty and Rachel because they've had the most experience with this.
Yeah, I just feel like it's, and I said this before, but I don't want to feel like I'm diminishing the progress that's been made in terms of fanfiction becoming destigmatized, because that obviously has happened over time to an extent. But you see it a lot in fandom, especially when we're talking about speculation of what might happen in the next chapter of the story. And it comes back to people feeling very differently about what's already in the story, is that fan fiction can be used as like this way to shut down what people are saying if it doesn't appeal to someone. So they can say, oh, well, that's just fan fiction, as opposed to legitimate speculation on what the next chapter of the story might be. And you do see it in this gendered way that, you know,
absolutely,
female fans writing meta will be dismissed as people who just want a fanfic version of the story, whereas male fans who put out like professional looking YouTube videos and make money from them are considered theorists, and it's taken seriously in a way that meta writing just isn't for some reason.
Yeah, it's absolutely especially when we are looking at the story from the feminine gaze versus the male gaze, because the male gaze is assumed. And in that context, you know, the most wild and preposterous theories like Snoke is Mace Windu will be like spread around the internet, but then that's essentially fan fiction, right? Because there's no way in hell it's true, but like, you know, it's something that you know, they want to headcanon into existence. And I just wish it was more visible that there is really no differentiation between them, you know? And also that obviously fan fiction isn't bad, but we as women theorists and speculators are absolutely not providing this information from a source of like imagination. We're looking at the canon itself and trying to deduce the aspects of the canon from our perspective. And I think the perspective part is the part that people get hung up on, because we saw that on Reddit and on the Jedi Council forums and even on Tumblr to a degree, where it was, if you don't fit with the status quo or the norm, then you are an outsider, and then we're also going to make fun of you because we think that you love Twilight.
Oh God. Yeah.
It's awful. It's awful.
Yeah. No, it's really bad, and it's particularly annoying because often these theory videos, they do take like meta, like and stuff from Tumblr as their starting point, and then they'll basically strip back the detail and just present the like Spark Notes version, essentially. Yet that is somehow the credible version of that theory rather than the original, which is just ignored because it's posted on this fan space that has a stigma attached to it.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of the context, like you say, because they have to strip it down for time constraints and because people have short attention spans, which is why they won't often read the original meta in the first place, they strip away a lot of the context and the literary analysis and understanding of what goes into the story in the first place in terms of tropes and archetypes and symbolism. And it just gets, I don't know, just brought down to these basic plot points, which I don't see how that could be too interesting to someone, honestly. It's like people just kind of want a Cliff Notes version of the story. Just like a Wikipedia page as opposed to actually seeing it unfold. And yeah, like I don't want to be too negative about it, but I do still feel like fan fiction is just considered the butt of the joke in a lot of male-dominated spaces. Like I noticed this at Star Wars Celebration, fan fiction was just kind of used as this source of comedy for a lot of people. That was kind of a bummer to see.
Didn't they have like a live reading of fan fiction where they were making fun of it?
Yeah, it was at the Making Star Wars party, which I went to. It's complicated because it's like, if you find that funny, then I guess you do you. But I don't think people perceive it as this thing that I perceive it as, which is kind of like a punching down.
Yeah.
Because women in fandom have been mocked for so long. And then I think it's often considered legitimate if other women are taking part in the mockery.
Yeah.
But that's just, you see that all over, don't you? Like women throwing other female fans under the bus for liking things that aren't considered acceptable by mainstream fandom.
Well, it's like you see this, they always get the token female fan who is accepted into the boys club so long as she conforms to the boys club's rules. And this is part of the issue that I have with male-dominated fan spaces, is because they mock fan fiction and they mock anything created by women, even if it's not fan fiction, because it is outside, it doesn't conform to their rules. It doesn't conform to their merit-based approval system. So they figure the only way to treat it is to mock it. And while my experience in fandom, while my experience writing fan fiction has been really good, my experience trying to write meta, has been a little bit different than that, right? Because the meta is an area that has been traditionally dominated by men, not by choice, but because they drive us out. And when I go into there, I will say something that is, this episode will be coming out after The Last Jedi, but stuff that I wrote about 2 years ago, not as fan fiction, but as meta, has come true, because I basically looked at what was on screen and what was canonically based for Star Wars, right? Made a judgment call about that. And yet that was considered fan fiction, and fan fiction was definitely used as a slur because I was saying stuff that they themselves had not picked up on first. And the problem with these videos now, and the thing that I have a big issue with fandom, is that with fan fiction or with meta or with anything else, is that it will not be considered legitimate by the rest of the fandom until a dude says it, basically, right? Yeah. Which is where that whole video thing comes in, right? So they trawl Tumblr for their Sparks Notes editions, and they take these theories that have been brought up by female fans, but it's not considered legitimate by the rest of the fandom until they say it, So, and I personally gotten to the point where I'm just like, fuck it. Like I don't care about you or your system. I'm going to operate outside of that. But like, that is just me, and I say that, but it's still, you can't divorce yourself entirely from the entire fandom because it's a shared space, right? Like you still have to deal with it to a certain extent, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think we talked about that a lot in our first episode, and I think I would personally like to make inroads into having men understand our side of the fandom, but we can't directly fight for that. Typically, you can't convince somebody to not erase you from the narrative, and our struggle isn't really that bad compared to other people that have fought for representation within fandom. But at the same time, I guess it's just really kind of depressing to know that is the way that things are, and that there's a lot of change that needs to happen before fandom is more inclusive in that manner. So, Rachel and Kirsty, can you talk about your experiences with that directly? Because you have been doing speculation online for quite some time, and we don't really need to give too much of a background on that, but I know that your experiences have been very unique in the fact that you've definitely interacted with people that consider themselves to be more mainstream fans or have more of a platform.
Yeah, I've actually been surprised by how positive and supportive fans have been to us, and I don't know if it's because our format is different. Like, again, if we're talking about the difference between what someone would consider fan fiction and like a theory video, that the same kind of goes for podcasts as well. They're somehow perceived as more legitimate ways to contribute to a fandom, and less shippy or whatever. Although we do get people sometimes recommending us with the caveat that we are Raylo shippers. Like, oh yeah, listen to them. They're really great at breaking down the story, but just so you know, they have this bias as if other fans don't.
Yeah.
So yeah, but overall, I think people have been really great with us, and I always get this little panic when I find out that someone I know from the wider fandom who is completely seemingly disconnected from shipping or our side of the fandom listens to us and loves the show and talks about it. I'm like, what? Where did that come from? Mm-hmm. So it's kind of nice that I almost feel like we're helping bridge a little gap for some people, because otherwise they might have to go to somewhere like Tumblr for this, and they probably might not do that because it is considered a more gendered niche space, whereas a podcast is more of like a safe way for them to consume that kind of fandom content.
Yeah, I definitely think everything changed as soon as we started doing the podcast. before that, I never felt like we broke beyond the Tumblr space. Everything we posted, like sometimes you'd get like quite a large response to it. Like I had metas with like thousands of reblogs and likes, etc., etc. But I never felt like that really reached anyone outside of Tumblr.
Mm-hmm.
And then with the podcast, and particularly through talking about the podcast on Twitter, which is like 99.9999999% Kirsty, because I don't really do the Twitter stuff, like that really like opened it up. And that was so interesting to me. So it's not like we're saying anything different from what we said on Tumblr. It's just being conveyed in a different medium. And I guess that podcasting is typically, like especially Star Wars podcasting, is typically more male oriented. And I think that's perceived as a more like cool way of getting your ideas out there and like getting your voice heard, because you're literally getting your voice heard.
Yeah, the literal voice hearing is the thing that I think is the most important, right? It's a humanization. When you're on the internet separated by like an avatar or a blog name, people don't necessarily equate your internet presence with a real person that has, whether it's, you know, age or education or whatever kind of merit that they want to place on you. So I find that having an actual voice and having them hear you and know that you are a living human being, you know, is really useful and really helpful. And I do think that you guys filled a niche. Were very few female podcasts. The ones that were available in Star Wars that were female-led are really great, actually, and not to discount their work because they've been doing it for a while, but it was really refreshing to have you guys talking about the new trilogy because of the fact that it had so many of this kind of metatextual, not just drama, but also this interesting, you know, conversation and dialogue that was happening within the Star Wars fandom around it.
Yeah.
We did feel like we filled a gap a little bit, and it's great to see more people like coming out and feeling like they can do that. Like I was really happy when you guys started your podcast. I know it's not Star Wars specifically.
We don't want to compete. We're not worthy.
It's not about competing. But,
I know.
Yeah, I love listening to you guys because it's the same kind of thing, really, isn't it? Like offering more of a feminine gaze perspective, which is, it's improving over time in fandom, but you always need more of it. So it's important.
Yeah, we're trying to undo like how many decades of history where women weren't really very well represented within like mainstream fandom, you know? So, I mean, I think we're all doing that to a certain degree, trying to kind of make up for the fact that we will be seeing a shift towards more stories and more writers that are looking from this perspective, but it's going to take time and you just have to be loud about it.
Yeah.
And I think another reason why podcasting is more well received or doesn't get that same sort of the quote unquote slur of fan fiction that like written meta does is because it's literally a different medium. It may seem like a really simple thing to say that, but one thing I've noticed online, especially with, I don't know, the way that female fans connect the dots for speculation versus male fans connecting the dots for speculation is that sometimes it literally is that simple, right? Like, you know, there's that bridge, there's that gap, right? Definitely the podcasting does humanize you. It definitely is. I think it is a more accessible medium too, because I personally love listening to you guys and listening to other podcasts when I'm working at home, you know, just doing illustration and stuff like that, because you can do multiple things at once. Whereas if you are sitting down and writing something that's like 10,000 words, it's a little bit, you have to set aside time to read those 10,000 words, right? So I think that's part of the reason why it is more well received, you know, because it's so much more accessible, because it's a new form of medium. And I'm really glad to see more women getting into podcasting and stuff like that too, because there's you guys and there's other podcasts as well, because I've actually been I've been involved with podcasts for a while, but I listened to podcasts way back in the day and it was like really male dominated again, right? You know, so it's great that women are out there doing their thing, you know?
Yeah, no, definitely. Like I really like the times we live in, you know. I think it's a really good time to be a woman in fandom. It's not without problems, but I do think there are way more opportunities to make your voice heard, and people are generally more accepting and more interested in hearing what you have to say than would have been the case in the past. And I think it is possible to like transcend these labels and like break through to different audiences than the stereotypical ones you'd be reaching as a female fan. And I think that's really cool.
I'm happy. So I think we've covered that topic enough. So let's move on to recommendations. I know that I came to this party with only a handful. I read a lot of fic, but I don't favorite a lot of them. I don't know about you guys. The only fic that I'm currently reading right now is Landscape with a Blur of Conquerors by Dias.
Oh, I love that one.
Yeah. It's on a weekly update right now, and she was on vacation, and I literally felt like, like I was tweaking out, like waiting for the update to that fic. It's so good.
I think for me, this is weird because I don't normally like AUs.
Mhm.
I normally like canon compliant fics, but I really, really like Inheritance of the Resistance by Water Lily Rose, I think. And yeah, it's like a Tudor era Raylo AU.
Oh my god.
It's
Nice.
like done in like a parallel of like Henry VIII's court. And the idea is that Ben Solo is like the disgraced son of King Han. And basically Han has married the young orphan Rey, but they actually have like a platonic marriage so that you don't consummate. And then basically Prince Ben falls in love with his stepmother.
Oh my god.
And it's really good. It is
Oh,
so
that
good.
sounds interesting.
That sounds amazing. I love
It
it.
is really good. Like, it's the kind of thing where obviously as a concept it's so unrelated to Star Wars that it's hard to talk about, like, and take seriously at face value, but it's a genuinely good story
Yeah.
that I really, really recommend. I think you've read that one, Kirsty, is that right?
Yeah, I have. I like you. I'm not a huge fan of AUs. I prefer Canonverse, but there are some really good ones out there, and that's one of them. Okay, so I have two fics that I'd want to recommend to people who maybe haven't read any Raylo before. The first one is A Collision of Stars by Dust of the Ancients, and that is kind of Canonverse, but also AU in that Rey and Kylo Ren get stranded together on Dathomir. So there's
Ooh.
Oh, I've read that
kind of
one.
like
That's
a
really
Clone Wars
good one.
component.
Yeah.
If you go into that, yeah, it's great. It's a real slow burn. There's lots of angst and betrayal and all the good stuff. And the other one is Sword of the Jedi series by Diasterisms, who you mentioned. This is another kind of AU in that it's like Rey is a Jedi in training at the academy
Mhm.
with Ben Solo, but it's so good. She's such a great writer, but people probably already know.
Yeah, the best part about her writing is that she sources a lot of canon, like to the point of like it's almost absurd. Her notes at the end of her chapters because of how much she's throwing in. That's from the from the EU or from the current canon. She's got like an encyclopedic mind on how to incorporate that textual, like literal detail into her work. So that's probably one of the reasons why I'm so hooked on it. I don't know about you, but I did start reading the Jedi Academy AU fic that she wrote, and I'm liking it so far. It's the Jedi Academy of AU is actually like one of our fandom's major contributions, right? Because we were all wondering, were Rey and Ben training together when they were younger? Because everybody kind of came up with that, and it was shut down really quickly in canon, but everybody still went with it because it's interesting.
Exactly.
So, Shai, do you have any recommendations?
Do I have recommendations? I have lots of
I can see your
recommendations.
list.
I cut it down. Okay, so I've been reading, because other people were bringing Star Wars recommendations, I decided to bring other recommendations from other fandoms. I should also specify that I have been reading fan fiction for 16 years, so there is absolutely no way I am going to fit even like a 1% of the fics that I've read into this podcast, but I have a couple of the current ones that I'm reading and some that are old favorites. One from the Dragon Age fandom is called A Lesson in Drowning by the Hero Complex, and the ship for that fic is Fenris and Femhawke. And I'm recommending this fic because it does such a good job with psychological horror and suspense, which is actually really hard to find in fan fiction. A lot of the times it's fluffy, and I'm not really big into fluff. But anyways, in this story, Hawke and her companions, they're flush with victory. They've just defeated Daenerys. They're celebrating at a pub when Hawke is attacked, and it really fucks with her head, basically. And in the beginning of the story, you think that it's going to be a simple angst fic where she's nursed back to health or something like that, but it becomes so much more. Like, it turns into this whole Cthulhu mythology with the sea and just these horrific creatures that come up from the ground. And it just had me on the edge of my seat. Yeah, it came out of nowhere. It was absolutely amazing. It's still ongoing. It's updated sporadically, but not frequently. So it has been updated this year, so it's not dead. Another fic that I really want to recommend, a story from the Mass Effect fandom called Violence, Voyeurism, and Vigilantes by Affleck. The ship for this one is Garrus and Femshep. And
You should explain for the casuals what Garrus is.
Garrus is a space raptor chicken who is like 7 feet tall.
Oh my god!
He is definitely an alien. He has got an exoskeleton, and his dick folds up inside him, and he is, but he is so cool. He's a really good sniper, and like just imagine a giant walking raptor who's really sarcastic and has got a potty mouth. That's Garrus.
Yeah, but he's also very respectful, and in canon they actually basically allowed a romance between you and him because of the fans.
But I should also clarify this is that Garrus, this 10-foot tall raptor, the 7-foot tall raptor chicken, and Femshep, like Commander Shepard, who is this human woman who's like 5'3", they're actually a canon pairing. They hook up in canon, right? So this is not a crack ship. Anyways, so violence, voyeurism, and vigilantes. I'm recommending it because it's a subgenre of fics that is like basically the missing moments fics, and this story takes place in between Mass Effect 2 and 3, and it's one of my favorite fics of all time. It's complete, and it focuses basically on what happens after Commander Shepard is killed in the destruction of the Normandy and then comes back to life, and what does Garrus do in the meantime and how they get back together. It is really, really well written, really great pacing. It's really, really focuses on the interpersonal relationship between the two of them, while also bringing outside elements of plot into it. It's also super smutty, so if you not into human women. No, it's more than a lemon, man. It is way more than a lemon. It's straight up porn. So if you are not into a 7-foot tall dinosaur fucking a woman, you might want to avoid.
Sorry, we explore new lows in this podcast. No, I'm just kidding.
No, there's lots of sex that happens like by third chapter they're already doing it. So there is that fic. It is finished. It's really well written. Unfortunately, it's the only story that F-like has written. That's it, right? There's no others. And the last one that I want to recommend is one from like my teenage years. It's still one of my favorites. Was never finished, abandoned, but I still want to recommend it. And it is from the Naruto fandom, and it's Sasuke. That's the parent. And it is called Color Theory by Blue Green Apples. And I really recommend it because it is basically the story starts off simple enough. Sakura is working a job, and while she's working a job, she runs into her out on the lam teammate. He decides to take her captive, and normally this would seem very traditional and stuff like that, but it actually subverts this boy crazy housewife narrative that Kishimoto created for canon Sakura. Mm-hmm. So it does a really good job with her introspection and her characterization, and I really, really like it because of that. However, it was last updated in 2011. It was never finished, so I feel kind of guilty recommending it. Great example of Ohtze fan fiction.
Yeah, one of my favorite fan fictions that I actually was going to suggest was a K2SO and Jin Erso fanfic. It's human K2SO.
Okay.
And unfortunately, unfortunately it has not been updated, and I don't think it ever will, but I still consider possibly like finishing it for her, or not.
That's
really,
always such a sad thing when a great fan fiction goes unfinished. It's like, no.
Update someday, right? You get that meme of the skeleton waiting at the computer.
You never know, because sometimes when a new movie comes out, people get inspired to return to things or rewrite them slightly.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. The Rogue One fandom, unfortunately, I don't know if they're ever gonna.
It kind of petered out there.
Yeah, I think it's kind of dwindling.
Yeah, they all died. So as a closer to this episode, we usually go into what we call our confession session. And usually we ask each other very naughty questions. But in this episode, just to kind of maintain a little bit of maturity and professionalism, just a little, we're actually just going to, Cheyenne's written a question out here. I'm going to use that. I think we can go around, we can do the round robin and I'll answer this question ourselves. And I'll read it out here. What is the most controversial ship you've ever shipped and why? And no, you can't say Raylo. It's such an easy target, it doesn't count. And let's start with you, Rachel.
Oh my god. Well, it definitely is Raylo, but I know I can't answer that.
Second most then, right?
Second most. Oh God, probably Balam Brassix and Jupiter Jones from Jupiter Ascending.
Oh.
I'm not really into that anymore.
Mhm.
But when I was into Jupiter Ascending, I was into that. And that is freaky because Jupiter is the reincarnation of Balam's mother. So it's all kind of effed up. There were not antis in the Jupiter Ascending fandom. So it was never controversial in the sense that people were saying, oh, how dare you ship this thing? It's so wrong. Oh, you're so disgusting. None, that wasn't happening because no one cared. Because the only reason there's like Reylo antis is because Star Wars is so huge.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's what I would consider to be the most objectionable.
Hero villain ships, right? Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
How about you, Kirsty?
Well, I don't want to say it's controversial because, well, I guess it could be if you took it along the Reylo lines, but I ship Finn and Kylo Ren. And I know it's a crack pairing, it's obviously not going to happen, but I think their dynamic is super interesting, and I'm guessing they won't have much screen time in 8, but I'm hoping that things will kind of be resolved to some extent in 9.
Yes.
And so I really like it for the parallels between the characters, but it's such a rare pair in fandom. And I'm not sure why, because I feel like that should have been a pretty big ship alongside Reylo. But obviously the big slash ship for Kylo is Kylux.
And then you got Storm Pilot Finn Poe.
Yeah.
So
I always feel like I need to toot Finland's horn a little bit.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't have a fic to recommend, but you can search the archive of our own tag pretty easily.
Finlo, yeah.
And there's lots of cute art.
Yeah. And I think it's a good source of, I mean, I think you have a really good point that there's a major conflict between these two characters, and it's going to be transformed in some way throughout the entire trilogy. We know that for a fact. So yeah, hopefully we see more content in that after 9. So, or with the lead up to 9.
What about you?
Me? Okay. So mine was an accidental controversial ship. I was really into Skyward, which is Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. ship that was taking place, and basically they were both on the same team in Heroes, and then they decided to do a face heel turn, and Ward was actually Hydra the whole time. And so people that had previously been okay with it were now completely against it, and they kind of baited fans by having the actor that plays Ward come back multiple times in different forms. And, you know, whether he's being a villain or he's being, you know, he even has one season where he basically mind controls Sky. And so, like, yeah, it's a very controversial ship. I've seen responses to it from the actress Chloe Bennett on Twitter, even calling out fans for liking it. So yeah, I don't like seeing that, because I think also we didn't plan on the ship being bad when it first started, and you can't really undo the chemistry that they had, you know. And then they tease you by making it seem like he's going to go through a redemptive arc, but no, he's just evil. And no, he's going to go through a redemptive arc. Oh no, he's just evil. It's like the worst. And so I mean, I haven't really watched the new seasons of the show, but I've definitely kind of given up all hope with that, you know, like, especially after seeing what Chloe said. I was like, oh God, are we really this place where people are being, you know, shamed for liking something that the writers actually put out there, you know?
Yeah, to be honest, I don't really like it when creators comment on any ship, unless it's like a canon, like once it's become like the romance of the story, or even if you're talking about it in terms of the dynamic. But there's something weird about creators and actors being asked about ships.
Oh, I hate that.
Like, I see it a lot with the Last Jedi press tour. I've seen like Oscar Isaac and John Boyega asked a lot about Stormpilot, and I just don't see why people think it's okay to do.
Yeah. The only person
and it's so weird as well, because Stormpilot is really not that big a thing anymore. Obviously, there are still shippers. But I mean, in terms of the content that's being produced for that, I think it's being posted with much less frequency than like stuff for other ships. You know, I think there's even more like regular Finray content than there is Stormpilot content now. I may be wrong, but that's the impression I get.
I think the fandom on that side kind of petered down after it was shut down, you know, and that's pretty unfortunate. But I mean, we do see these movements like, you know, give Captain America a boyfriend, like, you know, Stucky's still going strong, but, you know, they're still asking Sebastian Stan questions about shipping, you know. So it's like, it depends on how much interest and how much visibility it gets, I think. And then in this case, I think just based on what they knew about the story, they kind of moved away from it. I think there was also some problematic aspects of the response to the writers in that fandom. There was some very interesting discourse going on. I think it scared people away from writing it. And yeah. How about you, Shy?
Oh, well, basically, I purposely, basically all my ships have been controversial. I gravitate towards them naturally. I think some of the top controversial ships that I have been involved with would be Jon Snow and Daenerys, both sex.
I love Jon.
The other one that was caused a lot of problems too was, and it was a total crack ship pairing, but it was like big in fan fiction for a while, and then it got completely wiped from the fan fiction archives during the purge. Was Garrus and his sister Tamari.
Yeah, we have a proud incest shipper here, so. Yeah.
I don't really have any qualms about it. There is very few things that will actually make me go, like the Dobby and Hagrid fic made me kind of go, ugh, I don't know if I like that size kink. But no, I am the one who is totally down for the dinosaur and human woman fucking, and very, very few qualms.
And that's like the least controversial ship you like.
I know. It's
oh my god!
Like Garrus and Shepard are actually. It's not. They are such sweethearts.
It's one of the most supported in Mass Effect fandom.
It is. Yeah. It is totally. It is a non-controversial ship. It is totally. Kittens and puppies and rainbows. Like they are just. It is the fluffiest ship I ship. And with the exception of if he wasn't a giant walking dinosaur, it would basically just be the most vanilla thing ever. But yeah, no, I've had tons of controversial ships. Those are probably the two top right there, because one of them is an aunt and her nephew, and the other one is his sister. So.
Even the aunt and nephew is not that controversial. If you were on Reddit during the lead up to the end of this last season, it was like every other word was boat sex. It was so funny. It was, yeah. Sorry, I spent too much time on the internet. Yeah. So I think that wraps up our questions. Thank you so much, ladies, for answering. And
no worries.
We're going to close the episode by letting you know where you listeners can find us. And I'll start with you, ladies. You want to go ahead and tell everyone where you can be found?
So you can find Scavengers Horde on SoundCloud and iTunes. And you can find me at Star Wars Nonsense on Tumblr or at Journal of the Star Wars on WordPress.
You can find me on Tumblr at Bastila Bay, and I'm Scavengers Horde on Twitter as well.
You can find me blogging at Ohtze.com, or you can follow me on Twitter at Ohtze_O, and Ohtze is spelled Ohtze.
And since Erin's not here, I'll let you know that you can find her at Holocroning. That's HOLOCRONING, and that's on Tumblr and Twitter, I believe. And you can find me at Ashes for Foxes on Tumblr and Twitter. For our blog, you can find us at metamashina.com, spelled metamashina.com, or you follow us on Twitter at metamashina, spelled the same way. And if you have any questions for the hosts, including confession session questions, which we happily take, you can send those into our contact form on our website at metamashina. Do not DM me with that. I will not ask. All right. Well, thank you guys, and we'll sign off here. But if you have any last words in terms of, preparation for The Last Jedi?
Oh, well, that will I think, no, nothing.
We're not prepared. None of us can be prepared.
None of us are prepared. And
trying to resist spoilers.
I think it's time now I've had a little bit, and now I'm like, I'm good. I've got enough. I need to just wait for the actual story.
Meanwhile, I'm over here like refresh on Twitter. Okay. Yeah. All right.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Oh yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for having us. Bye.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.
Bye.